I'm Paul Qualia. I'm the founding director of APAC Assistance. We have information and risk management services in the two sub-regions of Asia Pacific. That's East Asia Pacific, South Asia. I'm based out of Singapore. Today with me I have Bhargav Reddy, my regional operations director in Bangalore, and Shika, our Asia Pacific information manager based in Delhi, her assistant manager Ragha Sudaroli in Bangalore, and the team's research assistant for South Asia based out of Mumbai's Manzi Gord. Today we're going to cover off on the major issues affecting businesses in the Asia Pacific region. And the first one is the capacity for disaster management. Might ask Shika to carry on.
Yes, so the most pressing concern for South Asia right now, like any other country across globe, is managing the pandemic crisis. Some countries have done well with it, like Sri Lanka, whereas countries like India and Pakistan are really struggling to keep a check on the situation. There are above 200,000 cases of COVID-19 cases already confirmed in India and about 6,000 deaths. In Pakistan, there are about 85,000 cases with over 1,700 deaths. In Bangladesh, there are over 57,000 cases with 781 deaths. Now, these statistics are considering that India has tested only some 2 million people with a population of 1.7 billion, which is not very promising. The same applies to Bangladesh. There have been reports coming out of under-testing. There have been reports coming out of people showing COVID symptoms and dying, and that not being confirmed as a COVID-19 death. So we can't even go by these statistics to actually understand the impact of COVID-19 on South Asia, especially in countries like India and Bangladesh. Sri Lanka, however, has managed the crisis well. They immediately imposed a curfew right after soon after the crisis. So they have so far only have about 1,700 cases and only 11 deaths, which goes on to show that they have managed it quite well. In fact, they'd be starting tourism very soon and they're opening up their airports too. And the same goes for Nepal. They have done relatively well, but considering the size of Nepal, still a very small country, and they have over 2,600,000 cases. And they share their border with China and India. Both of the countries have had very high cases. So the possibility of a second wave in Nepal cannot be ruled out at this point. Any questions so far about just to do with statistics of COVID-19 in South Asia?
No, nothing. Please carry on.
Okay, so now along with these crises, there are multiple issues with workers being laid off, especially in India and Bangladesh. There have been protests by migrant workers in India because they've been trying to travel back home, and some have been laid off, and there are impending crises in Bangladesh with factory employees being laid off because Bangladesh is a big manufacturing hub for brands based out of Europe and brands based out of America like Gap. For example, now these companies, these manufacturing companies abroad are not getting as much demand right now, because of which they have had to lay off mass workers from multiple factories in Bangladesh. So especially since April, there have been protests almost every second, third day demanding severance pay, demanding some form of money, some form of relief. The government have tried to provide some relief for these workers, but there are multiple issues with the stimulus package actually being implemented, food actually reaching these places. So there are a myriad of issues there. Now, other than the deaths, other than testing, other than the number of cases and the issue of layoff, at the same time, India and Bangladesh have been affected by one of the biggest cyclones they have had to face in more than 2 decades. The cyclone was Cyclone Amphan, and it impacted India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Bhutan, and it has killed over 110 people, caused over 13 billion US dollars in damage. And Amphan is actually known to be the costliest cyclone ever recorded in the North Indian Ocean. It has surpassed even the record earlier, which held by Cyclone Nargis, which struck in 2008. And the impact of Cyclone Amphan on West Bengal, which is a state in India, has actually been way worse than coronavirus pandemic. And Chief Minister Mamata Banerjee has actually said that it will take them at least 4 to 5 years to come back from it, which is not a far-fetched conclusion to make at this point. The cyclone affected Sri Lanka. Some 2,000 people were displaced. Over 1 million were affected by Amphan in Bangladesh. They have had an estimated loss of around $11 billion in damage. And the Bangladeshi government is predicting that there will be more damage that would be incurred in the eventual future just for the country to recover from the damage. Over 1 million people were displaced in these countries because of the cyclone, and they have still not been able to go back home, which is another concern because of the pandemic crisis. They've already been dealing with contact tracing, they've already been dealing with undetected cases, and with so many people displaced, living in shelter homes, in very cramped up spaces, this is going to create even more logistical issues, even in the future for the governments. Why I say in the future? Because there is another cyclone that struck India this week. That cyclone is called Cyclone Nisarga, and it mostly affected Maharashtra and India. But even this cyclone has caused, again, mass displacement. Some 5,000 houses were partially damaged. Some 1,300 huts were damaged. And they're still only recovering from Cyclone Amphan, and now this new cyclone struck. Any question about the cyclone situation so far?
Yes, I do. I've got a general question in relation to particularly India's management of, and indeed Bangladesh's management or the disaster management capability. What are the major restrictions that prevent efficient disaster management, and what are the major things India and Bangladesh may need to do to lessen the impact on its society and on the businesses investing within India, especially clients like ours that have foreign investments of significant sizes in India and Bangladesh?
Yes, Paul. So there are a number of challenges to manage disasters in Bangladesh and India. First one would be a lack of disaster planning at a national level, even though some states like Kerala, who have suffered floods in the past and similar situations, they are prepared. But nationally, we do not have a very strong pandemic planning policy in place. And other than that, there is issues with the population. The population in India is close to 2 billion, and managing this kind of a population with a disaster is the second challenge I'd like to highlight. The third challenge would be displacing and then creating space in such a time for these people. That's another logistical challenge that the government is facing to manage disaster. The fourth challenge I'd say would be the long-term damage the cyclones cause, especially Amphan. In West Bengal, the lands are unproductive for a number of coming years. The state is not going to recover for a while. And the same applies to some areas in Bangladesh. So even if stimulus package is provided by the central government, the recovery is still going to take extremely long. And with limited funds and such a long recovery time, it's going to be extremely difficult to manage this disaster, even going 2 to 3 years from now, especially for some states.
So, but how often does India have cyclones, and when did they start in history? I mean, this is not a new thing. Can foreign investors with significant investments in the major cities and in the major states, can they expect that the government will acknowledge that crises are always going to happen? Look, not having a pandemic plan, that's obviously a problem, but they're not Robinson Crusoe there. If I look at my own expertise from when I was at International SOS, and then I extrapolate that into some of the governments, some governments have thought they were prepared, pulled their old MERS or SARS pandemic plan down and jumped into it, but they forgot that not all viruses are the same. In fact, there's an unlimited number of viruses nearly. But my point that I'm trying to draw out is there anything to give confidence to potential investors that India is progressing on the back of accepting crises are always going to happen in a country that has the land size and the population. So rather than everybody talk about the problems and the impacts, is there anything to suggest things are going to get managed better in the future?
So Paul, these cyclones have mostly affected coastal states like Bengal, Odisha, Gujarat for that matter in the past. They've not really affected areas like Delhi, Bangalore, where business are prevalent. However, Mumbai has been affected, and Mumbai has been affected several times. Every year when floods happen, there are always casualties, 4 to 5 people die, there are manholes, there is mismanagement of roads, there is rampant corruption, which makes it very difficult for these funds to be better utilized. So overall, it's better to do businesses in some states as opposed to other states because of high rate of corruption and their location closer to the sea.
Okay, got it. Thank you. So selection of states is important. I guess something we all must as a team always be cognizant of is one of the dynamics of crises is they don't occur where they used to, and they're not always what we expect them to be. So if we only prepare for cyclones in a coastal strip, they're always going to go to another part of the coast. If we only prepare for a certain type of virus of a certain magnitude and don't expect it to be larger, we're not planning for crises. We're planning for emergency response, which is significantly different to the definition of a crisis, which means it can totally affect the sustainability of a government or a company to function. And so I guess we're not going to get closure on that today, but from what you've told me and your education on the response to both the perfect storm of the cyclone and the pandemics, that the crisis management is very much in a basic state in India, and people should plan that that's not going to change. Okay, anything else, Anshika, before we start to look at the economic factors?
No, Paul, just one more point I'd like to make about the disaster and the pandemic bit. India has actually dealt with quite a few. We had swine flu, we've had cases of avian in the past, and even Bangladesh for that matter. South Asia has had a lot of diseases, and they've still not had a plan in place for an impending disaster such as COVID-19, even though they have had multiple opportunities in the past to learn from that. So that's something to be cognizant of as well.
Yes, and I think East Asia Pacific to a large extent has learnt its lessons from SARS and MERS. So they were very quick to have extremely strict lockdowns. They had not only very good contact tracing in place, but they had the teams to do it. They had developed softwares. So there is an extreme difference in how countries in East Asia versus South Asia have managed it, with the notable exception that Sri Lanka has done unexpectedly well. But India and China took the full initial brunt and is copping a lot of criticism, and some of it quite justified, some of it extremely unjustified and politically motivated. But India, with a similar population, has clearly neither got the societal disciplines in place, the societal controls in place, too many levels of government, and inadequate planning. But not only is their planning inadequate, India is quite clearly doesn't understand can't even define a crisis, and that's clear and obvious in that it's got an inability to manage the various levels of government and the complex governance that it has created. And they often revert to the size of India as a reason for that. Well, actually China's a little bit bigger. So they need to have a really hard, serious look at themselves if they want to attract investors and continue to develop, because a crisis they have is poverty, and poverty is always a latent violence within society if it isn't managed. So without further ado, I might ask for Raga to move on to economic issues, if you would.
Sure. So I'll be talking about the economic issues in South Asia after the handling of the COVID-19 crisis and what we can expect. The immediate issue is the decline of the economy in South Asia, which has large-scale ramifications on the region. The unprecedented crisis, which is posed by the COVID-19 crisis, means that South Asia might experience its worst economic performance in 40 years. And according to the latest figures, growth in the region is projected between 1.8 and 2.8% this year, which is down from 6.3% projected 6 months ago. There were significant gains that were made in the poverty alleviation measures that have been taken by various governments in South Asia, and they are most likely to be wiped out in the region. Government policy should ideally aim at flattening the recession curve and jumpstarting growth. In the region, state-owned banks are much more common in South Asia than other regions, and they play both a negative and positive role in economic development. On the negative side, we can see that these banks suffer from corruption and inefficiency, which reduce the competition by slowing innovation. But on the positive side, the lending by these banks usually focus on the poor people and those who are living in remote areas. So from the crisis alone, what we're noticing is that the poverty that is already existing is, accelerated so much more because there's large-scale job loss. From many studies that have been recently been released, more than 120 million workers in India, most of them are small traders and daily wage earners, they've lost their jobs in April. And economic activity has all but ceased in most of these countries in the region, and they forced a nationwide lockdown. About 15 million people of different sectors will likely be unemployed in Bangladesh due to the slowdown. And some economic analysts have estimated that nearly 20 million people may lose their jobs in Bangladesh due to the COVID-19 crisis. When we come to investments, there are a lot of challenges as well, because the recent studies show that foreign investors have pulled out an estimated $26 billion from developing Asian economies. A report on May showed that foreign investors have pulled out $6.4 billion from the Indian equity markets, largely due to the COVID-19 outbreak and due to the risk-averse environment. What we're clearly noticing right now is a pessimistic foreign investor sentiment across Asia. Coming to the stimulus packages, various governments in the region have released stimulus packages with different economic measures that are mainly targeted at the poor population. So some of the measures are the food distribution system, kind of reinforcing the transfer of food, cooking gas, cash transfers that are being done to lower income households, insurance coverage for workers in the healthcare sector, there's credit support to the MSME sector, and wage support to the low wage workers. So with the economic stimulus package measures, there is going to be an increase in government spending largely, and we're going to probably see a lot of inflation on the rise in the region that is going to put an increasing pressure on the budget of the government. Are there any questions so far?
I've got no questions, but I guess the same issue that I raised with Anshika, if we look at this from the macro issue where we've got China and India often competing for foreign direct investment, and you can throw into that ASEAN and in particular Southeast Asia countries like Vietnam, Thailand, Indonesia. Is India coming out of this as a more attractive or a less attractive source for foreign direct investment, for future foreign direct investment? Is it going to compete better and get more of those dollars? Or is it going to be seen to perhaps not be as great an alternative as pre-COVID-19?
Certainly, I think that the Indian government likes to position itself as an attractive alternative to China. And a lot of Washington policy wonks are also kind of vying for India to, be a counterbalance to China. However, the ground reality is very different. Unlike China, India has severe infrastructural challenges, structural challenges that are yet to be addressed. And even with the new government supposedly taking on all of these challenges and kind of expanding its powers in the COVID-19 crisis to address these challenges, it's quite a long way from actually, emerging as an attractive destination. There's a lot of talk of restructuring of the global supply chains, and the Indian government has apparently mailed and contacted different members within the trade and commerce industry in the US to kind of attract investments, about 1,000 companies. So what the Indian government is trying to do, and it has a plan to attract investments. However, there is a reluctance from foreign investors due to the bureaucracy, the red tapeism, the rampant corruption, and with the COVID-19 crisis, there are additional challenges to it as well. So to answer your question, I think that pre-COVID-19 crisis, there were investments that were coming in. There was a lot of positivity in the developing economies. However, due to the additional burdensome challenges that are being faced right now, it's unlikely that investors are going to be attracted to come into the country to invest unless there are significant incentives to do so.
Okay, excellent. That's perfect. Thank you. I might progress now to Manzi. If you could give us an overview of upcoming elections, please.
Sure, Paul. So in South Asia, we're looking at some major upcoming elections in the course of the next 6 to 12 months. And so starting with Sri Lanka is expected to hold its parliamentary elections sometime later this year. Earlier, the elections were actually scheduled for June 20. However, there's been a cloud of uncertainty over the election process due to the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic. Just to give context to everybody listening, Sri Lanka is coming off the back of a serious constitutional crisis, which was originally instigated when the previous president, Sirisena, appointed former President Mahinda Rajapaksa as the Prime Minister, while Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe was still in office. He had not vacated the position of the Prime Minister, and this caused a serious political turmoil within Sri Lanka. And after which Sri Lanka elected Gotabaya Rajapaksa as its president in November 2019, and with Rajapaksa's and his administration's response to COVID-19 crisis, they imposed the nationwide curfew in time, and his approval seems to have increased because of that, and just before the elections as well. So although the opposition and a bunch of right group and have challenged the decision to dissolve the parliament in the Supreme Court, calling it illegal. Last week, however, the Supreme Court made a ruling that the decision to dissolve the parliament by President Rajapaksa was legal. And so now the election commission will be conducting the election of the parliamentary election soon, and the election commission has also announced that they will likely declare the dates for the elections coming Monday, that is on June 8th. Besides Sri Lanka, India will also see a number of elections taking place in the next 6 to 12 months, especially on a state level. So state level assembly elections are scheduled to be taken place in the states of Bihar and Jammu Kashmir in 2020, while the states of Tamil Nadu and Kerala and also West Bengal will likely hold elections next year. And these elections could potentially have a significant impact on the overall political dynamic on the national level as well, considering India is a federal or rather quasi-federal system. So yeah, that's about it from me.
Okay, thanks very much. I don't have any questions on that. I think another topic I'd like to chat about today is the dynamics going on at the geopolitical, regional and global level, particularly the trade issues between China and the States, and the criticisms of China and their retaliations open up some very interesting dynamics, right down to people trying, or countries and nations trying to develop mitigations to reduce risks from war and trade issues with China. So I might ask Bhargav to cover that particular issue.
Thank you, Paul. So in the emerging geopolitical scenario at the moment, India and Australia have signed a very critical agreement, mutual logistical support agreement, which will allow Australia to dock their ships and refuel them in Indian ports, both civil and military ships actually. Now, this is very significant in the current scenario where China has been aggressive on the border fronts, both in Hong Kong and along the border with India, especially in Ladakh and a few other sectors in the region. Now, along with the agreement, India has also invited Australia to one of the major annual naval exercises with Japan and the USA, making it a quadrilateral exercise. Earlier, India was reluctant to invite Australia onto such military exercises, fearing that this will project a very strong and aggressive stance towards China. Now that there is an aggressive stance from China itself, India has not been as apprehensive as before. Along with that, the entire scenario basically makes up for a potential counterbalancing act between India, Australia, Japan, as well as the US. Now, this is a very ambitious plan given the aggressive postures of China, but at the same time, it needs to be noted that Australia and India realistically share very limited interests in terms of defense as well as trade. The trade itself is underwhelming at about 15 billion US dollars. There are quite a few challenges which need to be addressed by India as well as Australia to some extent, how they can actually come together, both in terms of strategic and defense context as well as trade. Now, in terms of trade, yes, there are a few analysts who would suggest that Australia would look to India to shift their manufacturing bases to India, especially post-COVID. But at the same time, India itself is not geared up enough to cater to that requirement or replace China as a major manufacturing hub for various reasons, both internal and external factors. So at this point, may I pass it on to Paul if there are any questions?
No, I think that's very clear. I guess, again, my fear is the reality versus the dream, and the complex bureaucracy, issues of corruption, the complexities of laws, the perception from Indian governments that they have sorted out the different legal systems and jurisdictions, but the reality on the ground is there's a lot of different powers you have to deal with. So I guess we need to stress for potential investors or even existing investors in India with problems that they perhaps need to look at which state they operate in and consolidating into the states that give them the best support and the best infrastructure. I guess the point I would stress, Bhargav, and we'll carry this off on our next session next week when we look at East Asia Pacific. But if we look at, in my eyes, India's level of development is such that it's really competing against Indonesia more so than China or Vietnam. So really the countries that are going to compete against India are Myanmar, that's really getting its act together as an investment destination by getting rid of red tape for companies that are opening. Thailand, that's very established and has excellent infrastructure. And Indonesia, that has its problems with very high severance pays, corruption and inefficiency, but it has also improved a lot, and it's consolidated itself with a one-stop business shop and less red tape. Right down to we've seen a very complex, comprehensive economic partnership agreement that's been signed off both by the parliaments of Jakarta and Canberra that gives it a very, very strong mutual agreement, which offers a significant competitive advantage. And I kind of feel India's, rather than, yes, it's making some improvements, but while it's running a little bit quicker, the other runners are running even faster. So it may be making incremental change, but the leaders of the race are they've only got one lap to go. India's got 4 times around the circuit. So I hold great fears. But team, thank you very much for a very concise coverage of the very complex issues facing our clients in South Asia. And Bhargav, if people wish to reach out to us to learn about our membership services, then they can contact you directly, or what's a generic email address they can contact?
They can contact us at iqueries@apacassistance.com.
Okay, thank you very much, team. Thanks, team. Thanks very much. Cheerio.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Paul.